be here. Okay. So a couple things that I didn't put in my biography. One of my claims to fame is I am a pun person. So I like to do puns. So there may be a couple little puns in this presentation. Another thing is I enjoy playing the jumbles in the newspaper where you have to unscramble letters and then you have to figure out the answer to the clue. And there may be a few jumbles in this presentation as well. Okay, so let me hit play and get going. So this, Amy, is this meeting is being recorded? Is that, can I get rid of it?
You might be able to drag it out of your way, like click on it and drag it.
Hit continue. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to give you some information about photographing the sun and the moon. And it basically is showing you how to get a good photo of the moon both by itself as well as in another composition, as well as photographing the sun and finding out all the ways that the sun can enhance any photo. I'm also going to do a little history, so you'll see some historical aspects of photographing with the sun and the moon also. Now, because we are going to go over photographing the sun and moon, I thought I'd start each section with a Vincent van Gogh painting. And one of my favorite, which includes the moon, is Starry Night. And you see Starry Night here, and I've always enjoyed it, but doing a little research, I found out there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. And the main parts about it are the sky, which is probably the most dramatic part, the cypress tree, which you see on the left, as well as the hills, sort of in the bottom right, and you see the town, and you see the church. Now, first of all, this is one of the few paintings that Van Gogh painted that wasn't an actual scene. So many of the paintings he painted were scenes that he actually saw, and this is not something that he would have seen as one image. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the different strokes, for the sky, the brush strokes swirl. And he is showing that the sky is a divine part of the image. It is the most dreamlike and beyond human comprehension. The cypress tree, which is the tall tree on the left, the hills and other trees, they bend and swirl, matching the swirls of the sky. So they are a part of nature. The town is entirely different. It has straight strokes with sharp angles separating it from the heavens. And notice the church's spire goes from the town to the sky. And so what Van Gogh did is he brought God to the village. And so I thought that was very interesting to start out. Now, this is the first detailed photograph of the full moon. And it was done back in 1840 by John William Draper. And you think about, photography, you wonder, did it really go back that far? But it did. And we sort of remember Matthew Brady during the Civil War, but there were people taking photographs much before it. Okay. Now, historical purposes, a lot of times when we think of photos of the moon, we think of the Apollo 11. Okay, so we think of the Apollo 11, and these are three photos from that journey. The first one is the Earthrise from the lunar orbit prior to landing. The second is Aldrin poses for his portrait. And the third one is Aldrin salutes the flag. Now, one big controversy about this is notice that there are no stars visible taken from the lunar surface. And this was true of the Soviets when they went around the moon, as well as the Apollo 11. And the reason is because they had to set the camera to daylight settings because of the brightness of the moon. And with the daylight settings, the stars were too faint to be visible. And people thought this was a hoax, and it was so prominent that there's a moon hoax theorist named Bill Kaysing who wrote a book called We Never Went to the Moon. And I checked, and the CleveNet Library System has one copy of it. So if you're interested in We Never Went to the Moon, CleveNet has a copy. Now, I was really curious, are there any moonwalk pictures where wait, let's go to this first. I'm sorry. Then they did. They had to make a special camera to take to the moon, and so this is the Hasselblad 500EL, and this was first used on Apollo 8, Apollo 9, and Apollo 10 before 2 were brought to the Apollo 11 mission, and they were used for photos inside the command service module and the lunar module. And they had 2 lenses, a normal lens and a telephoto lens for close-ups. Now for the surface shot, they had a special version, the 500EL data camera, and this was used it was built for the extreme conditions of space with vacuum conditions and temperatures from 248 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun to minus 85 degrees Fahrenheit in shadow. It had a wide-angle lens and had a polarizing filter to reduce reflections. Now, you notice in the left-hand picture and the right-hand picture that it was mounted on a bracket on the chest of the astronaut spacesuit. So in both photos here, you see Neil Armstrong with it attached to his spacesuit. This provided support to the camera and made it possible to manipulate the rings and levers with both hands. A trigger was fitted under the camera to make it easier to fire. Now, we're used to looking through a viewfinder of some sort, but there was no viewfinder on this camera. So before they left for the moon, they had to practice pointing the camera when they were preparing for this mission. There were 3 preset focusing distances, near, medium, and far, and they had to practice to get estimate the correct focusing distance, and there was a simple sight on the lens where they could point the camera in the right direction, and so they did a lot of practicing of just pointing it to the right direction to make sure they could get the photo that they wanted. So there was a lot of preparation for this camera. An interesting thing was only the film was brought back, the cameras were left behind on the lunar surface. So here's the shots. Here's Armstrong with the camera. We have Aldrin taking soil samples, and Armstrong aims his camera. Now I was wondering, like there are all these photos of no moonwalk with stars, and I scoured Google. I did all these searches. I figured, is there any example of a photo with a moonwalk where their stars are showing? I found one. I do not understand why NASA did not mention this. But here's the one I found of a moonwalk with stars actually visible. Okay. Now, another famous person is Ansel Adams. And these are 2 of his photos, very famous photos with the moon in it. The first one is Moon and Half Dome, obviously taken at Yosemite National Park. And the second one was Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. So, in terms of the first one, here's what I found. Ansel Adams and his companions were traveling by car after an uneventful outing in the Chama Valley. The storm skies has cleared over the Sanj de Cristo Mountains with a ghostly gibbous moon rising above an old adobe church and a graveyard in the distance above. As Ansel Adams recounts, we were sailing southward along the highway not far from Espanola, and when I glanced to the left and saw an extraordinary situation, and this is the one on the right, okay, an inevitable black and white photograph. I almost ditched the car and rushed to set up my 8x10 camera. I had a clear visualization of the image I wanted. The situation was desperate. The low sun was trailing the edge of clouds in the west, and the shadow would soon dim the white crosses. So what you see here is you see that it was sunset, and he was losing light very quickly, so he got the moon. But if you notice in the left-hand part, and I'm going to sort of circle my mouse here so you can see it, in the left-hand part, here's the moon on the church, but you notice there's a lot of moons that are catching the sunlight in this graveyard in the bottom right-hand corner. And the clouds were catching the light also, but notice that everything was rapidly changing. Now for the one on the left with Half Dome, the story is this picture was taken one winter afternoon during a stop while driving toward the Ahwahnee Hotel in the Yosemite Valley. The moon rising above Half Dome as the shadows of the setting sun were creeping on the dome's 2,000-foot cliff drew attention to a picture that could not be missed. Adams was using a spotlight meter with an angle of view of only half a degree, so he was able to take a light reading from the moon alone in the scene. So with all the other light there, he concentrated on getting the light on the moon exactly right. Because black and white film tends to be more sensitive to blue light, and so photographs including the sky that we perceive as dark come out with the sky being very bright and featureless. On this occasion, a strong orange filter was used. So he used an orange filter to darken the sky. Now it turns out that these both were famous, but the one on the right-hand side is probably his most famous of all the pictures. And this indicates that when you are looking for photos of the sun and moon, it pays to be in the right spot at the right time. And a lot of times you never know what you're going to find. So, it's a good idea to travel and, try to find situations like that and grab at them when you can. Now, even though Ansel Adams took many photos in Yosemite, he never took Yosemite for granted. Okay. Now, here's the equipment that I use to photograph close-ups of the moon, and this is the camera that I use, and this is the lens that I use for close-ups, and these are all the different parts. First of all, I have a DSLR camera, which is a digital single lens reflex, which means I look through the lens. You need a zoom lens so you can zoom in more closely, and the larger the millimeter, the better zoom you have. So a 200 millimeter or longer is good for a close-up of the moon, and I have a 400 millimeter. This is the longest lens that I have. And I have to crop the photos that I get a little bit because even though it does zoom in, I still have to crop it to get a good shot of it. I use a tripod because you want things to be steady, and when you're taking a shot, you just don't want any camera shake because you want the details like the craters and other markings on the moon to be as clear as possible. I have a shutter release cable, which is what is hanging from the cable on the right-hand side. The reason I do that is because even if it's on a tripod, if you press down the shutter, the camera is still going to move a little bit from just that pressing down. So a shutter release cable releases the shutter without any movement to the camera itself. Now, for close-up tips of the moon. I've seen that when I take photos, I can use autofocus or manual focus. And the two photos I'm going to show you of close-ups of the moon, I did one with auto and one with manual, and they both turned out very well. Now, if I choose to use manual focus, because you want to zoom in on the details like the craters, there is something on most DSLR cameras called live view, where instead of looking through the viewfinder, which is right here, you look through the screen, which is right here. And this button right here, which has the plus on it, allows you to zoom in, and you can zoom in amazingly close to see like individual craters very easily. And what you can do is you can manually focus those craters, and then you'll know that you are in good focus. Now, you would not need to do that for autofocus, but for manual focus, that would be a good thing to do. Okay. Now, another thing is underexposed, because if you're taking a photo of the moon at night, the full moon especially, is going to be very bright, and the details will be lost. So you want to underexpose by either lowering the shutter speed or lowering the aperture, which is the size of the light that goes through the lens. You want to underexpose. Now, here are the important camera settings. And those at the very top, if you go to the left on the top two, it lets in less light. If you go to the right for the top two sections, it lets in more light. Now, the first one is aperture, and that's basically the opening of the lens through which light passes to enter the camera. You could consider as like the pupil of your eye, which can get smaller or larger. Now, obviously, the the larger the aperture, which would be the one on the end here, more light is going to be let in. The smaller the aperture, which is the one here, less light is going to be let in. Now, it does something else. It adjusts something called depth of field, and that's like how much in the distance is in focus. And if you look at the photo, if you look at the pictures here, the smaller the aperture, which is letting in less light, you're going to have more of the picture in terms of depth in focus. So if you were to focus on the person in the front, the mountains in the back would also be in focus. But notice as you travel to the right, as the aperture gets larger and larger, notice that the mountains are getting less and less in focus. So you're getting a shallower depth of field. When you're here, the person is in focus, but basically most of the rest of the image would not be in focus. So depending on what you do, if you want like everything to be in focus, you would use a smaller aperture. You do not necessarily have to go to f32. You could go to one of these like f16 or f11. But if you would want the person to stand out, and let's say it's a very busy background, you're doing a portrait, you would want a more open aperture so that the person stands out and the background is not in focus. Now the second thing is shutter speed. Now again, when you go to the left, it's letting in less light. When you go to the right, it's letting in more light. So at the shutter speed, this is saying the shutter is open 1/1000th of a second, which is very fast. Here it's 1/125th of a second. Here it's 1/2 of a second. And notice that someone who is moving very quickly, that person is going to get more and more blurry because the shutter is open longer. Now, a lot of times you're not going to be taking a photo of someone that is moving, so sometimes the shutter speed, you're more concerned with if you're hand holding your camera. Even if the camera shakes a little bit, I do not want the picture to be blurry. So when I'm taking photos of like someone just posing or a scene without much movement, I might do 1/125th of a second so that the camera movement when I push the shutter button down, that does not affect the photo. But if I'm taking a picture, let's say of a hummingbird, where I would like to capture the fastly moving wings still, I would want a very fast shutter speed. So I would go to like 1/1000th of a second, even up to 1/5000th of a second to get that wing as still as possible. Now again, the faster the shutter speed, the less length of time the shutter is open, so it's going to let in less light. So if you're at 1/125th of a second, and let's say you want to go to 1/250th of a second, and you're at an f-stop of f8, you may want to go to a more open f-stop to compensate for less light going in. So they play off each other. Now the last one is called ISO, and to the left darkens the photo, to the right brightens the photo. Now, it's basically whether it's more or less sensitive to light. In ISO, to the left, like ISO 400, is more sensitive to the light than ISO 50, so it would be more sensitive to light and it would be brighter. ISO 50 is going to be less sensitive to light, and so it's going to be darker. But notice that it looks like the backgrounds are getting darker where it really says it's brighten the photo. There's another thing that happens with ISO. As you get a more sensitive to light ISO, like 1600, 3200, 6400, you get a more grainy image, and that is called noise. So even though the cameras are very good at noise reduction, it's good to be as small a numbered ISO as possible so you get as little noise as possible. And sometimes you just can't help it because it's very dark, and you can go in like Photoshop and do noise reduction. So if I refer to aperture, it's whether the lens the opening is getting smaller or larger. Shutter speed, it's opening more quickly or less quickly. And ISO is whether it's more or less sensitive to light. Okay. Now here's an example I took up of the full moon. This one I used manual focus. So I used that live view and I focused in very closely, and I sort of focused on these craters right here. And notice here I got a very nice image. I end up underexposing, so all the detail would be a little more visible. I did have to crop this because my 400 millimeter camera just, had it a lot smaller. Here's what I took of the half moon, and this one I used automatic focus, and notice it did very well. So, depending on how things are, you can choose whichever one you want to do. Now, when you're taking photos where the moon, you want it to be as part of some type of landscape, or you want something else to give it a sense of presence, and you want to take, let's say, the moon rising or the moon setting, there is a website called the Photographer's Ephemeris. And what it does is you move, there's a map obviously, you move a pinpoint where you think you would like to take the photo. And it shows down here, the dark blue line says where the moon will be setting. So if I'm at this position, I follow this line, and if I want to take it in relation to the downtown skyline, I see where it's going to be setting in relation to Tower City and Settlers Landing. Then sunset would be this one, which is the bright orange. The sort of dirty yellow one is sunrise, and the light blue one is moonrise. Now let me point out something about sunrise and moonset. Notice moonset and sunrise, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, they are almost at the exact same time. And when people think of taking photos of the moon, they picture taking photos of the moon when the moon is brightest in a dark sky. But if you're trying to take it in connection with other parts of a landscape, if you have this bright moon, the rest of the landscape will be very dark. And so the nice thing to do is if you can see when the moonset and the sunrise are very close together, the moon will still be very nicely visible, but everything else in the photo will be visible too. And so notice that the moon set 4 minutes behind the sun rising. And so the buildings were very visible, but the moon turned out to work out very well in terms of making a nice image. It also tells you, for example, that the moon is waxing. It's at 99.22% when the moon was setting. And notice it was waxing still at the moon rise. So you can see like how much of the moon will be visible. So for this photo, this was the pink moon just a couple of months ago on April 26th. Now, here's the position I was. There's not a lot of good spots on the east side, and I live in Cleveland Heights. There's not a lot of good spots on the east side where you can get a nice shot of the skyline where you're above everything. So I discovered that there's a parking garage on the Cleveland Clinic campus where it's at East 93rd and Chester, and that's where I put my pinpoint. I go to the very top level, and you get a nice view of downtown, which we'll see in a second. And the nice thing about this parking garage is you get an hour for free. So I always time myself to make sure that I'm in and out before the hour is up. I consider myself very frugal and thrifty. Okay, so here's the photo I got from this. Now notice that this is when the moon is exactly setting. So if the moon is higher in the sky, obviously it will not be exactly in this line. So there's the photo I got from that particular photographer's ephemera shot. This was the pink moon, and there were clouds, and I was very lucky because right down here where you can't see the bottom of the moon, there were a bank of clouds which I really couldn't see, but very soon the moon totally disappeared, and I was expecting to take a few more shots when it was lower, and that did not happen. But you can see all the buildings very nicely, but the moon is very nicely visible, and it makes a very nice image. Now here's another one I took. This was, I wanted to get a shot of the moon setting by the West Side Market Tower. So what I do is I drag this pinpoint around to various locations, and I ask myself, will this location line things up where I want it to go? Now it turns out for this one, here's the West Side Market. I was at the left hand end or the west end of the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. And notice it lined up very well with the market. Now here is St. Ignatius High School, and you'll see that it sort of lines up with St. Ignatius High School as well. If you look at the bottom, the sunrise and moon set, again, were very close together, so things were still lit very nicely, but you still got a nice shot of the moon. So this was on May 7th, 2020, and there's the shot I got. There's the West Side Market. Here's the tower of St. Ignatius right here, and I tried to get the moon very close to being right on top in the middle. But notice the fact that the sunrise is very close to the moon set really does not detract from the image at all, and it makes a lot more things visible. Now, another shot I did is, this was a super moon, and let's see the date. This was November 13th, 2016. This is one that they were talking about, you know, on TV and everything. It's going to be a really big super moon. And I found that there is a little subdivision here right behind St. Luke's Hospital where it's a subdivision that they started building houses for, there was like a city home, Arama type thing, and they started building houses, but they didn't complete the subdivision, so there was empty land, but the land slopes down, so you again get a nice view of downtown. And so here's the moon that I got there. Now for this one, notice it's a little bit squashed vertically. And so when the moon is near the horizon, it can be squashed vertically because it's going through more of the Earth's atmosphere, and so there's a little bit of bent light that takes effect. Okay, so this is a little bit squashed, but notice how, now this one was darker, but notice how much brighter the moon is to the rest of it. And here it got squashed a little bit more. Now it turns out that there's a rare phenomenon where it only happens for a couple of seconds, and luckily I was able to catch the next photo. When the moon starts squashing, something very interesting happens just for a brief moment, where it looks exactly like a yellow squash, and then a couple seconds later, it's gone. So notice it squashed a little bit more, but this was another moon set, and again I used the photographer's ephemeris to see that from that location, everything lined up exactly as I wanted. Now, for the moon rises, here I'm looking at the light blue line, and my pinpoint is at Upper Edgewater Park. That is a wonderful location for the moon rising over the Cleveland landscape, the skyline. And if you look at this gray road here, this is the West Shoreway. So you go to the end of the West Shoreway, you turn right where it ends, and then there's a little parking lot here, and you're sort of above the beach area, but this is Upper Edgewater. And in like, I think October, November, and December, the rising moon lines up very nicely here. And this was on, again, in 2016, November 13, 2016. And here's the shot that I got. And there's the moon rising. This was a super moon over Upper Edgewater. So that's a beautiful place. You can still see the sun is reflecting a little bit in Key Tower, but you know, and you got a little reflection in the water, but it turns out to be a very nice lineup of everything. Okay, now you don't need a big landscape to make an interesting image. There was one Thanksgiving where I was visiting in-laws in northern Kentucky, and it was a full moon rising, and I looked up, and from their back deck, I just tried to give it a sense of place by just having it between some trees. And so I focused on the moon. Now I used a very shallow depth of field here, so notice that the trees are not focused like you saw on that little chart, but still they show that it gives it a sense of place and not just looking solely at the moon. Okay, now we're coming to the sun, and so I start with a sun photo from Vincent van Gogh. And this one is called The Sower. And for here, he has great orbs of light. So the sun, notices a large white ball. Short, precise brush strokes radiate outward from the sun. The ground has a textured, surreal feel. And notice that the farmer actually sort of blends into the earth a little bit. And notice right here, there are two crows blending in. Now, because we've seen two photos of Van Gogh, now if you want to unmute yourself, can anybody tell me that if Van Gogh had grown up in Northeast Ohio, what high school would he have probably gone to? Does anybody have an idea? You can either say it or you can put it in the chat. Don't think too deeply. Anybody come up with it?
Not seeing anything in the chat here.
Okay, the answer is Brush High School. So that's where he would have gone to high school. So another one of my bad puns. Okay. Okay, now we're in the sun section. Now here's the oldest photo of the sun. It was taken back in 1845 by physicists Louis Fizeau and Leon Foucault. They used a 1/60th second exposure. And notice there are visible sunspots. Now, here's the first photo inside the sun's corona. And here's what the corona is. It's a jacket of gases called an atmosphere. The corona is the outermost part of the sun's atmosphere. The corona is what is visible during the total eclipse. It extends far out into space. From it come the solar winds that travel through our solar system, and those are responsible for the northern lights. The corona's temperature causes its particles to move at very high speeds, so the particles can escape the sun's gravity. Wait, I went the wrong way, I think.
Whoops.
Okay, now this was taken by NASA's Parker Solar Probe on November 8th, 2018, and so it was taken very recently. It was taken 16.9 million miles from the sun, which means that the atmosphere extends out at least that far. And there is a picture of it. This solar probe was the first ever to touch the sun. It's the size of a small car. It travels directly through the sun's atmosphere, ultimately to a distance of about 4 million miles from the surface. It's protected by a 4.5-inch thick carbon composite shell, which can withstand temperatures reaching 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to go around the sun a number of times. On its final 3 orbits, it will fly to within 3.9 million miles from the sun's surface. It will answer questions such as, why is the corona much hotter than the sun's surface? How does the solar wind accelerate? What are the sources of high-energy solar particles? At the closest, it will travel at about 430,000 miles per hour. So over 7 years, it'll complete 24 orbits around the sun. It'll complete 24 orbits around the sun. Now, since this launch date was August 12, 2018, it only took September, October, November, 3 months for it to take that initial photo that I showed you in the last slide. Now, here's a quote I found about the sun, which is sort of interesting, because we all know that the sun is very bright, and it can even, it can really change a photo. Annie Dillard writes in her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, we have really only that one light, referring to the sun, one source of all power, and yet we must turn away from it by universal decree. Nobody on the planet seems aware of this strange, powerful taboo that we all walk around carefully, averting our faces this way and that, lest our eyes be blasted forever. And just like there's many religions that do not look at God, the sun is almost God-like. So the sun is really the brightest part in an image, and so if you basically adjust your camera to the light of the sun, everything else will be very dark. So there's something called HDR, or high dynamic range. And what it does, it basically takes a number of photos, and it takes the lightest light, and it takes the high dynamic range is the difference between the lightest light and the darkest dark that you can capture. And so an HDR photo, it takes photos at different exposures, which it then combines into one image and combines the lightest of the darker areas and the darkest of the lighter areas. So here's the final HDR image. Notice it took the lightest of this darker area. It takes the darkest of the lighter areas. And so here's the final HDR image. And my camera does HDR images automatically. If you set it to HDR, and you can choose like 3, 5, or 7 images, you hold the shutter down, it'll take 3 images, and this was taken at 1/45th of a second, 1/30th, and 1/20th of a second. Then I went to Photoshop and I combined them into one, and this is the resulting HDR image. Now I have an older iPhone, an iPhone 7, and there's an HDR setting there where if you see you have a very bright part of a figure and some very dark areas, it'll combine figures and make one image in HDR. So it works out very nicely. Now we're coming to sunrises and sunsets now. Here's a sunset on the summer solstice, and the summer solstice lines up, if you're at Settlers Landing, it lines up very nicely with the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. But what you want with a sunrise and sunset is you want to give it a sense of place. The sky, obviously is going to be there. Water will do a nice reflection, but water is not necessary. Here's another one where it gives it a sense of place. This was taken from Upper Edgewater, like I showed you before. But again, as the sun rises, you can wait for the right moment for it to be in a nice relationship between buildings in the skyline. Here, my wife and I took a trip to Iceland, and we just come out of this restaurant, and there was this beautiful sunset. Here we have a nice foreground. The reeds in the foreground give the picture a sense of depth. But again, it's very nice to capture all the different colors that are in this case, the sunset. The mountains give it a nice element of depth also. Now here I was at Lake Erie, very close to the former Wildwood Park, and notice that there are no clouds in the sky. But what I did is I positioned myself so the willow tree gave it a nice frame of reference. So always look for composition techniques like that. Besides just the sunrise, you can move yourself one way or to the other and get a nice composition where the sunrise or sunset still draws your eye, but there's so much else going on in the image. Now here there was no water involved. This was at Kendall Hills in Cuyahoga Valley National Park. And again, the reeds give a nice sense of depth. They give something in the foreground. The clouds give some interest in the sky. But again, it's just a nice sunrise. But this one does not have any water, but still very appealing. Now here we're back to our old friend, the photographer's ephemeris. I'm back at Upper Edgewater here. I see that the sun is going to rise. It looks like right over Public Square. Now realize that's where it hits the horizon. It takes about 5 minutes or so to get above the buildings. But this was taken on August 24th, 2018. And this is the shot I got. Now I waited for this one. I saw that it was peeking up sort of in the middle between the BP building and the terminal tower, but I waited until it was right behind it, and I sort of got a nice image there. And the water makes a nice shot as well. It gives it a nice sort of a glimmering glow. Now, clouds really intensify a sunrise or sunset. I live in Cleveland Heights, very close to Lower Shaker Lake, and it's sort of a nice little 5-minute ride. Sometimes you go there thinking that you're going to see color, and you really don't. So I haven't gone very far to be disappointed with no color. But here there are very smooth clouds, and I got a very nice reflection in the water. And so the clouds really make a nice detail to a sunrise or sunset. Here the clouds have a totally different texture. This is still Lower Shaker Lake, but notice they sort of have a pebbly feel, and the orange is much more dramatic. So different types of clouds give different textures to the sunrise. And here's what is called a sun pillar. Now, when I went to Lower Shaker Lake, I was not expecting to see one of these. It sort of just happened, so I was very pleasantly surprised. And for a sun pillar, it's when sunlight reflects off the surface of millions of falling ice crystals associated with thin, high-level clouds. So this was obviously taken in the winter. The ice crystals have roughly horizontal faces and fall through the atmosphere, rocking slightly from side to side. So they rock slightly from side to side. This is why people say that sun pillars rock. Okay. But that was like a very nice feature. I wasn't even expecting to see it. Now, I love starbursts. Notice starbursts are where you see like a little star effect with like these little rays coming off of the sun. And for the starburst, here's what you need to do. You need a narrow aperture such as f/22. So notice that f/22 gives you a very wide depth of field, so a lot of things are in focus. But a narrow aperture also gives you starburst, or sometimes called sunburst. Starburst, if you see the sun is going to be visible. Now, you need something to partially block the sun with another object. So here, I sort of kept moving myself around until I got it partially blocked by that tree trunk. So I moved around until I saw that happen. Whoops, let me go back. So I walked around until it could happen. But notice it adds a nice detail to this photo of Daffodil Hill. Now here I was at Doan Creek. This is a little bit west of Lower Shaker Lake as Doan Creek goes down to University Circle. You see the starburst there. I was there before the sun even rose over the hillside, but once I saw the sun there, I tried for starburst. So again, I manipulated myself around a little bit. Now this is not related to photographs of the sun and moon, but notice how this waterfall has a very dreamy flow to the water. If you want to try to catch this, you need a longer shutter speed, such like maybe 1/2 or 1 second. And what it does, it smooths out the water so you get a very nice effect. If you want to see the droplets individually, you would do a very fast shutter speed that doesn't show the movement flowing. So this has nothing to do with the sun and the moon, but it's a nice effect to try to get. Now, my wife and I went to Iceland, and there's a concert hall called Harpa Concert Hall, which I love the architecture. We took a tour. This is the outside of the atrium, but again, I wanted to try to catch a starburst, and there it is. Now, being most of you from Geauga County, this is Lake Kelso. And I'm a part of, I taught at Mayfield High School. I'm a part of a biking group of staff members where we bike and start at different locations around the greater Cleveland area. And one of our locations we start is on the square in Burton. Well, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll get there early with my camera and try to catch a sunrise photo over Lake Kelso. So the sun was coming up over Lake Kelso, above the trees. I tried for a starburst, and notice I got a little individual starburst in the reflection as well, which I was very pleased to get. And you'll see Lake Kelso a little later. This is Cuyahoga Valley National Park. This is Beaver Marsh. Again, there's a starburst. Now, my wife and I took a trip to Baja California, and there were these 5 tall cacti, and I positioned myself in between, set to f/22. I got a starburst. Now, we were on a Rhine River cruise, and we were on the boat, the river boat, coming into Amsterdam, and there was this old sailing boats are just docked on the bank, and I tried to get a starburst, by the mast. So I had to position myself in the right spot. I got f/22, and there it was. Now, here I wanted to show you, this is a starburst I got. This was downtown. I went down to the flats. This is like the new part of the East Bank where the flats East Bank development is now. There's a nice boardwalk. And so this was the sunset. So we're following the orange. Notice the sunset is 5:12 p.m. So it was like January 7th. It was a relatively warm January 7th. But notice the shot I got here with the nice starburst. There's a starburst behind the bridge. Now for this one, there were a lot of seagulls flying around. So remember that if you change the shutter speed, you can capture things moving relatively quickly. So because I wanted to have the seagull sharp, I did a relatively fast shutter speed, maybe like 1/250th, 1/500th of a second, and I got the seagull right here. But I got a very nice starburst for the sunset. Now, here's back to by Lake Kelso. That's the Burton Wetlands Nature Area. On one side of the road where the parking lot is Lake Kelso, where there's a nice meadow on the other side. So my biking group was not ready. Sunrise had also taken place already. So I started wandering around the meadow, and there were these two branches that were very close together here. So I positioned myself in the right spot, and I got a nice sunburst. You'll see this tree a little bit later in a different part of the presentation. Now, there were droplets on some grasses, and I got a starburst on each of the droplets. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be looking directly at the sun. Now, sometimes things will happen where, you have the F-22, you're hoping for a starburst. Again, something strange will happen. Something strange will happen. Here's a starburst I did not see coming. I mean, it just looks very strange to me. I don't understand what happened. Later on, it just was normal, but here's a very strange starburst. So, now, backlit mist. This is one of those things where you want to be in the right spot at the right time. You want to be at the right spot at the right time. And you may not know that there's going to be mist there, but if you see mist there, take advantage of it. For backlit mist, morning is the best time for fog to be there, and the sun starts to burn through it. You want objects in the foreground to give a sense of depth. Now where this is there's a nature preserve in Willoughby Hills called Hatch Otis Nature Preserve, and it's off of River Road, Route 174, a little bit north of Route 6. And there's a big cliff and overlook looking over the Chagrin River. So I went there just looking for some sunrise pictures, and I noticed the mist was there, and I tried to capture the backlit mist. And here's another backlit mist. This is back at Lake Kelso. And again, the mist was coming off the cold water, and it just makes the photo a little bit more dramatic. Now, catching sunbeams. Now on my right-hand side, I have everybody is present, so I'm not sure if you can see this, but if you can see the whole picture, the little place where the starburst was coming through, this is the same tree, but it may be blocked on your screen. But here are sunbeams. Now for sunbeams, morning is best because you need mist and you want a gentle sunlight. So I saw these sunbeams and I took advantage of it. If you have a few branches, like in this image, you get larger sunbeams. If you have a lot of branches, you get smaller sunbeams. Okay, this one has a lot of branches, and so I made sure the sun was blocked by either the leaves or part of the trunk. And then, so that's how I hid the sun. I hid the sun with the object making the beams. So here we have sunbeams where, I just happened to look and I saw it and I took advantage of the image. Now here we were in the Hudson Valley and we were in a bed and breakfast directly across from the Vanderbilt mansion, and I woke up and I saw that it was sort of misty, so I drove around the grounds, and here's an example of the smaller sunbeams being formed by many branches. So again, it's a very nice image, and take advantage of the sunbeams being there. Now, crepuscular rays are pretty much the same thing, except the sun is blocked by clouds. So here there are beams of light extending from clouds in early morning or early evening when the sun is shining. There's a cloud between you and the sun where the cloud blocks the sun. And when the light peeks through the object, small atmospheric particles scatter the light, creating the beam. This was taken in Seattle. We had spent a couple days in Seattle, and it was sunset. And this was Olympic Sculpture Park, and I just took a walk down there, my wife and I was just seeing if I can get a nice sunset picture. Well, the crepuscular rays were there, and it was a very nice image. Now, sun can also do things like amplifying textures, where the sun is really not in the image, but it enhances the image. If the sun is at a very low angle, notice how you can make the textures of this leaf really stand out. And here was a hosta plant where the sun was at a low angle, and it just took the textures of the hosta leaf and it made shadows. It made everything stand out a little bit more. Another thing it can do is it can do backlighting, where the sun is really not the image, but it's between you and the subject. And here there were little reeds or grasses in a field. This was in Geauga County near Parkman. And I just, positioned myself where I got the backlighting from it. Again, it just makes the image that much nicer, and it makes the image stand out. Here we're again in Baja California, and we have the same effect where there's backlighting. Now, here's an interesting thing. I was at the botanical garden. This is like one of those calla lilies, those big leaves. And notice here's the side that the light was shining on, where it does add a little bit of texture, but there's no backlighting. I sort of snuck behind the leaf, and you'll see this is the same leaf. The whole thing changed by the backlighting. The lighting changed, the color changed, everything. So here's the one before, here's the one after. And just by experimenting and looking to see what's there, you can get a totally different looking image. Now, it doesn't have to be just shining through things like leaves or making things glow. You can take flowers that are backlit too. It turns out in photography, usually sunlight is too harsh when it's shining directly on the front of a flower, but when it's backlit, it really makes for a nice effect. So here are some narcissus plants. This was at the botanical garden where they are backlit. Here is a peony. This was at Stan Hewitt Hall, where it was backlit very nicely, and it creates nice shadows and makes things stand out, and the colors sort of glow, but they're not harsh. Now here was a spider web in Geauga County. This was backlit. Now if you remember when we talked about aperture, I said that if you have a really wide aperture, you get a very shallow depth of field. Here I picked a very wide aperture, like I think 1.4 or 2.8, because I wanted the spider web to stand out. I wanted the background to be blurry, because sometimes a busy background will distract from your object. And I did not want the spider web to be distracted from. So here, the aperture of a very wide aperture made for a nice blurry background so that the backlit spider web stood out. And here we have a starburst, and we had backlit grasses, and there's mist all in one photo. So this was very exciting. Now, the sun, you can also use the sun for reflecting. So when I come home from swimming early in the morning, and there's this one spot on this one road where I can see like a very tip of Key Tower. And there was one morning in March where I saw this bright orange. I was trying to figure out what it was, and here it turned out to be Key Tower reflecting the sun. So the sun can add a dimension to an image. And here's another one. I was in a very deserted part of the flats. I was waiting for a sunset, and the sun, I was right above the rapid tracks. And notice how the sun really enhanced the wires and the tracks of the rapid. So the sun is really not in the image, but yet it really adds something to the image. And I wasn't expecting that to happen, but when you see it, take advantage of it. And again, if I wasn't there, I would not have seen it. Now, my brother likes to tell me, why don't you try this and why don't you try that? So because on the autumnal and vernal equinox, the sun is supposed to rise directly east and directly west, he said, well, you know, you live near Cedar Road. Cedar Road runs directly east or west. Why don't you see if you can capture that? Now, realize that Cedar Road is a busy road. And so this was luckily a Sunday morning during the pandemic, so it worked out very well. But I had my tripod, just like you saw in the setup before, and what I would do is I would test things like, am I positioned right? How are my settings? I'd be in the middle of the street, all of a sudden a car would be coming, I'd scramble back to the sidewalk. I'd go to the middle of the street, I'd scramble back to the sidewalk. my wife saw this picture and said, my gosh, those cars are so close. But I had my 80 to 400 lens, and a zoom lens will compact distances. So where you see this bus shelter here, I was almost at Cedar and Fairmount. This bus shelter is at Coventry, a half mile away, but looks very close. I really wasn't in that big of a danger. But notice that this shows that the vernal equinox does pretty much rise directly east. Now, I told you about autofocus. Just like with the starburst effect, sometimes things happen that you don't expect. Here, something happened with autofocus that I didn't expect. All of a sudden, there was an auto there in the picture. So, you know, it went back to the sun, but for a second, there was an autofocus. Now, here's another little riddle. So if you can unmute yourself, because we have an auto or a car here, can you tell me what the best car is for a photographer? Any ideas? And I'll give you a hint, it's not a Mustang.
Focus.
Very good, the Ford Focus. Congratulations. So the Ford Focus is the best a car for a photographer. Congratulations. Now, when I was taking that picture, let me go back to the one without the car. When I was taking that picture, again, I've read where sometimes everybody is bent on one particular image, and sometimes you get a very nice image just looking the other way. So if we go back to this one, I turned around on Cedar, and there I had a reflection again. So I took a picture of the Key Tower reflecting the sun very much as in the similar image. And sometimes, you know, people, you turn around, you get an equally nice or even better image. Now, sun creates shadows. And so here, shadows can really add dimension to a photo. When you're closest to the summer solstice, when the sun is highest, and you go to the atrium of the Art Museum, you get this wonderful grid by the top of the Art Museum atrium. And notice the dimension it adds to it. So shadows can really add something. Here I'm looking the other way. Here was a group of students with a lecture, but again, the shadows just add something. Now, we went to the Galapagos Islands at least 10 years ago, and you're always taking photos in the zodiacs, you know, taking trips on the zodiacs. And here was a picture of a pelican, but notice how the shadow adds a dimension to it where you can see the space between the beak and the neck even in the shadow. So always look for shadows. They may allow you to add something to the photo. Now, here's my favorite shadow photo. We were in Iceland. Now, on the last day we were in Iceland, we were walking back to the hotel, and this was like an apartment building by our hotel with the spiral staircase. And I saw that the spiral staircase's shadow was being cast on this building. So I ran back and got my camera, which is not very far, and I captured this wonderful image of the spiral staircase sort of elongated on the building. Now, here's a weird story about that. I told you about the Cleveland Photographic Society where I always done any competitions. I must have done hundreds of photos in Iceland of waterfalls and landscapes and the like. And I entered this photo in Iceland in one of the competitions. This Icelandic photo scored higher than any of my other Iceland photos of nature, which is really strange. But I really love this image, so it's one of my favorites. Now here's something to just get special sunlight moments. This is also in Iceland. We had crested a hill, and I just saw all these little spots of light on the water. So I took a picture. And now we come to rainbows. Now, the rainbow light is reflected, and what happens is, let me just read it. A rainbow is caused by sunlight and atmospheric conditions. Light enters a water droplet, slowing down and bending as it goes from air to denser water. The light reflects off the inside of the droplet, separating it into component wavelengths or colors. When light exits the droplet, it makes a rainbow, which is what you see. The angle between where the sunlight enters the rainbow and exits is 42 degrees, so the sun can be no more than 42 degrees above the horizon. A secondary rainbow is caused by a secondary reflection made inside the droplet and re-reflected light exits this droplet at 50 degrees instead of 42. The secondary rainbow appears above the primary rainbow, and the order of the colors are reversed. So this was in Costa Rica on the Continental Divide. This was in Iceland on the very last day before we got back to the hotel, and that spiral staircase was there. And this was a little bit, maybe 10 minutes later, also in Iceland. On the left, you see the secondary rainbow, and notice that the colors are reversed. The purple and violet are on the right-hand rainbow. They're on the left in the left-hand rainbow. So, very interesting. Now, we were in Iceland, and I was able to capture the northern lights. So, for these are caused by solar winds escaping from sunspot regions and being hurled into space. Reaching Earth in about 40 hours creates these dramatic displays. Now, here's a story about in Iceland for the northern lights. This was the first place where we had a chance of seeing them, and so I was in a motel. I took my camera outside, and it was like almost dark, but not quite dark. I didn't see anything except these wispy clouds. Well, there was a German man who was also out there, and I said, "Gee, there's no northern lights." He said, "Well, see those wispy clouds? Those are really very faint northern lights. You know they're on clouds because they're not reflecting the light." So he says if you do a long shutter speed, and so I think I did 20 seconds, your camera will capture the light that you will not see. So this was a northern light photo where I did not see any of the green, but my camera caught it. If I had not talked to him, I would have taken my camera back to the motel and read a book, but thanks to him, I was able to capture this image. Here again is the same thing where these are northern lights where I did not see the color, but the color was there to my camera with a long shutter speed. Now, a couple of days later was another location where we could see northern lights. The laser beam you see here, we could actually see with our eyes. It lasted about 10 minutes. So that was a northern light that we could actually see. We drove back to our motel, and here were northern lights that my eye could not see the color, but I saw the wispiness, and I knew they were there, and I was able to capture the northern lights. Now, I told you I like to make up jumbles. So here are some jumbles about the sun and the moon. I think they're mostly about the moon. So I have the scrambled letters there. See if you can come up with them. Here's the first one. Neil Armstrong's favorite New York City theater was what? He might come up with the answer.
Apollo. We have Apollo in the chat.
Excellent. The Apollo Theater. Congratulations. Here's the second one. What's the moon's favorite chewing gum?
We have Orbit.
Excellent. 2 out of 2. Here's the third one. The restaurant on the moon was unpopular because it lacked this.
Atmosphere.
Excellent, excellent. 3 out of 3. Here's the last one. The best place to grocery shop on the moon is this.
All right. In the chat, we have Crater Joe's.
Excellent. Crater Joe's. 4 out of 4. Congratulations. Now, there's one thing that I was very famous for at Mayfield High School that I didn't put in my biography, but thanks to Richard Glove back in 2001, he asked me to do an announcement on the morning announcements at Mayfield High School about Pi Day in honor of the number pi. And so what I did is I wrote lyrics to a song and I sang it on the announcement. So that became so popular that every year after that, except for one where I did a poem, I took a song, I wrote the lyrics, and I sang it either on the announcements or after retiring, I made a YouTube video. So to end my presentation, I have made a song which I'm going to attempt to sing. And so this is going to be sung to Somewhere Over the Rainbow. Now I have to give myself a beginning pitch, so hold on. Okay, here goes. Try to take photos of the moon and sun. Work on good compositions, get out and have some fun. Full moon rising and setting in the sky. Sunrise, sunsets with brilliant colors are worth a try. Photographers ephemeris will help you find a promising location. Anticipating capturing that perfect image can become great recreation. Aperture, shutter speed are now your friend. Knowing how they can help is useful to comprehend. Now get out there with all you know and keep on looking for that next rainbow. So that ends my presentation. So let me close up the keynote.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to just go ahead and unmute yourself. Questions, comments?
Very interesting. I was wondering, do you ever have any problems, when you're taking more direct pictures of the sun and you, with either the camera or maybe looking too long with your eyes when you focus on it?
Yeah, like I do. In fact, like when I was doing that vernal equinox picture, it was really strong. So I sort of try to look to the side and try to focus on something to the side. Well, I wasn't looking directly at the sun, but that is a problem. Look this because the sun is very bright. So that's the best I can tell you. Is I just look to the side and try to focus something, on the right or left.
Does it do anything to the camera?
No, I don't believe so. Because it's just light. It's stronger light, but it's just light.
But you're not magnifying it, right? It's not magnifying it.
See, I mean, I know if the lens may do that. I mean, the lens could do a magnification, but I don't think it's ever affected the camera at all.
Okay. But you just have to be careful with your eyes.
Yeah, don't look too long.
Right.
A blind cameraman, isn't a good thing to be. So.
Thank you very much. It's interesting.
Good job, Ron.
Thank
We
you.
loved it.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you. So hope it gave you ideas of with the sun, even not taking a picture with the sun, but just trying to incorporate what it does to images. Also, look. The key is having an eye where you notice things like that. Some people see things like that and never bother to explore and see what possibilities there are. So,
What time frame does the that ephemeris, is that how you pronounce it? What time does it cover, like 2 weeks in advance or a month or a whole year?
oh no, the photographer's ephemeris.
Yes.
There's a calendar where you can go back years. Now you have to click all the time. But for example, like when I was showing you some of those early pictures from 2016, I did that like, when I was preparing this thing, and I just went back to 2016, and you can go back to that day and put your pin exactly where you are, and you can see it. The interesting thing is, like, how they just built that bridge on Wendy Park to Wendy Park?
Yes.
On the map and the photographer's ephemeris, they have the little part where the one part of the bridge is green, which means that the map is obviously up to date, and it doesn't match the date that you're choosing. So,
Okay.
but no, you can go back.
How far in the future? Does it extend out into the future, like for months or what?
I don't know. I've never explored that, but I'm sure it does because
Okay.
going on vacation. I mean, people have apps on their phone that do the same thing, but going on vacation, you could explore things. What I do a lot of times is I'll have the photographer's ephemeris open, and I'll look at a particular location. Then I'll open up another tab with Google Maps. I'll look at Street View to see what I can see there. Because photographer's ephemeris, you don't have access to Street View. But Google Maps you do, and I have both of them open concurrently.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Excellent.
You're welcome.
I've never heard of that, so
That's great to know.
I texted my friend about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a subscription version, but just like I was frugal with the parking lot, there's also a free version. So, you know,
That's good.
subscribe. So it may have fewer features, but it has all the features that I need. So,
Super. Thank you.
welcome.
All right.
Ready?
All right. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so, well, thank you very much. That was very, very informative and
Great,
beautiful
Ron.
photography. Excellent photography.
Thank you. It was weird being on Zoom because if there were any groans or anything about the puns, I couldn't tell.
I loved them.
We all loved them.
So thank you. It was fun putting that together. So I had a great time, and I learned a lot too. You know, a lot of those things I didn't know. So it
Excellent.
opened
Say
my
hello
eyes.
to Marcia.
Will do. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Have a very nice night.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Okay. So could you email when you put the link on? When
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, I send it to Heidi actually from the Park District, so she's the one who puts them up on the Sky Watchers. But I can send you the video. Actually, I can send you a link to that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you. Good job.
Thank you very much.